very much for joining us today as we discuss the impact on global mobility during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. Due to the restrictions on global mobility during COVID-19, organizations have been challenged on how to best support the health and safety of their international assignees, while of course being able to ensure business continuity. The outlook, however, on global mobility is a complex picture to paint. We will see changes in the short, medium, and long term that will challenge organizations in different ways. So to help us decipher what those challenges are, I'm very pleased to be joined today by Dr. Philippe Dubert and Michelle Berners-Price from KPMG's Global Mobility Services team to help give their perspective on the current complexities and what the post-COVID-19 environment may look like. So without further ado, the first question I have looking to the short term are, what are the most common concerns you're both hearing from clients globally? And maybe Michelle, I'll pass this to you first.
So I think when the COVID-19 pandemic first hit and started impacting multiple countries, the key focus of companies and mobility teams was on getting their employees home and ensuring that they were safe. Since then, we've seen that companies all over the world are dealing with requests from their employees to work from home, even where in some cases that home might be in a different country to their country of employment. Some HR teams have full oversight of employee whereabouts, but in many cases, there's nobody with a complete set of details showing where each employee is working right now. So in one example, we saw an Italian national who was on assignment to Hong Kong when the COVID-19 pandemic started. He took his family to Milan in early 2020 to prevent them from getting stuck in what was thought at the time to be an Asia-based health issue. But when he returned to Hong Kong, he found that he was then stuck and isolated from family who were themselves in the middle of the worst outbreak point in Europe. So what we've seen is that people will do what they feel they must in the circumstances to protect themselves and their families, and company policies are somewhat powerless to stop them. While that scenario was quite extreme, large numbers of employees have applied for approval to work from another country, and some companies we're working with are processing requests like this for more than 5% of their entire global workforce, as people are becoming more comfortable working from their home or family environment. And these unusual work arrangements are going to continue, we think, in the longer term. They show no immediate sign of changing. So mobility teams are now looking to monitor and manage the compliance and regulatory risks that those working practices might be creating. So for example, that might be payroll withholding requirements or corporate tax, registrations and filings for the company, as well as exposure, where there might be regulatory restrictions to the type of activities that an employee can carry out in that country. We did see the global authorities announcing some relaxations of the rules where border closures and lockdowns had left employees stranded. But as time continues, those relaxations are being lifted and the risks and costs are only increasing. So what we're seeing right now is that mobility teams are seeking to get this under control to the greatest extent that they can and put in place processes and policies to manage future cases.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle. And Dr. Philippe, anything you'd like to contribute from your perspective on what clients have been concerned and challenged with globally?
Definitely. I think what we've been seeing organizations going through at the initial stage of this crisis, definitely looking for information precisely to deal with their international assignees and to know what to do with their people, whether they were business travelers or families or international people assigned in countries where the lockdown measures were gradually implemented. So I think the first challenge was really to be able to identify where to look for reliable information to take the right decisions with regards to their mobility people. And the second challenge, I guess, was, as Michelle alluded to, was to deal with the extreme complexity and variety of situations where at the same time you had individuals that had chronic conditions in countries where the level of security wasn't appropriate to move them back home, and they had to deal with a complex issue, the access to care, transportation, evacuation sometimes, whereas in other places there was a bit more walk in the park, where it was just about moving groups of people, families together with mass evacuation out of these countries. So having to deal with this situation at the same time with a different sort of situations, what I think what the companies were exposed to at the beginning of this crisis.
Great. Thank you very much to both of you. The next question I have, I guess, is more in the medium term. So as we continue to see, as you alluded to, the opening of borders and the restarting of domestic travel becoming more frequent, what would be the key considerations you'd advise organizations to both ensure that business continuity, but also continuing to protect the international assignee populations? So maybe Michelle, I'll pass this over to you.
So we are now starting to see borders beginning to open and people slowly starting to move again. And it is important to be aware that the rules on movement will be different to those in place before COVID-19, and may also not apply consistently to travellers from all locations. So what that means is that for both business travel, but also for new assignments, more care will need to be taken than before to ensure that both the employer and the assignee know what to expect. And we are going to see some slightly unusual scenarios. So today I became aware of a case of a client who had a US employee who was a German citizen and a long-term US resident. Now, he had decided to lock down in Germany to be with his family members who needed support, but he now needs to get back to home life and work in the US. But at the moment, German nationals can't fly directly to the US. So instead, he's flying to Mexico and looking to cross the Mexico border to re-enter the US. And this is the solution that's genuinely been recommended to him by professional advisors. And they said it should work, but obviously there'll be an element of keeping their fingers crossed. So we are going to see many situations like this where there's a bit more complexity around the actual travel arrangements. And when entering a new assignment location, it will be important to thoroughly check whether it's possible to enter that country and to obtain a visa or a work permit, as well as other pre-travel documentation in the usual way, to avoid being stuck at the border on entry when the assignee actually gets to that location. And it will also be important that companies are aware of any changes in tax law or the interpretation of tax law in that host country. We are starting to see the compliance side come into focus much more, which we think will only increase as lockdowns and concessions are traded for border protection and tax collection. I had a discussion with some mobility leaders this week, and what I learned was that each of them had taken a conscious decision not to worry about or focus on corporate tax risk caused by their displaced employees up till this point. And that was given the expected leniency during lockdown of the global authorities. But what they also called out was that they realised that this soft approach won't last much longer, and they do urgently need to come up with a plan to ensure longer term compliance. As non-compliance with legal requirements can, of course, create significant problems for the employer and also for the assignee from a reputational, but also from a cost perspective. So I think those are the key things to think about. What is the impact of COVID-19 on the actual ability for individuals to move across borders? But also if they do move, what are the compliance obligations that will be created as a result of that travel or assignment being initiated?
Great, thank you, Michelle. Dr. Philippe, what would you like to add to those recommendations?
First of all, I can't agree more with Michelle's point with regard to understanding the impact of COVID in the destination countries. Of course, it goes beyond what companies are already doing with understanding what national regulations are, the policies, the measures that have been implemented with regards to mobility restriction or public health restriction as well. But from a medical standpoint, or a health standpoint, definitely understanding how healthcare resources are being available. And as you know, it's been critical in many countries understanding whether or not the healthcare system, emergency care system would cope with a surge of cases is something that is critical. Understanding whether or not testing is being required. More and more countries apparently are implementing these testing requirements for business travelers, for travelers to their borders, understanding what it means in terms of practicalities, where to be tested, what sort of test, how to interpret results, and what will be consequences of the results of this test is something that needs to be understood, of course, ahead of the destination. From a very practical standpoint, I think, and Michelle mentioned this before, that really is the responsibility of our organizations to manage the whole travel segment, from taxis to airlines to hotels, all the places where business or international assignees would be sent to need to be vetted, validated, risk assessed, so that in a way the travel is as safe, or the destination is as safe as possible, or known as safe as possible.
Great, thank you very much. Continuing in the sort of medium term, Dr. Philippe, a question for you from the perspective of the international assignee. How do you think COVID-19 will impact their aspiration and willingness to go on international assignments?
That's a good question, Kayla. I think what this crisis brings is definitely more emphasis on the dual responsibility an employer and an employee, so international assignee, may have together when it comes to being deployed internationally and with regards to international mobility. International assignees may be expecting more from their employer with regards to risk analysis, as we said before, understanding all the threats that they may be exposed to, and in turn, what sort of measures are implemented by the organizations to mitigate as much as possible their level of risk. What are the behaviors they should adopt from a health and a security standpoint to be protected, whatever happens in their destination. But at the same time, I think from a transparency standpoint, I guess people are expecting to comply more and to be more willingness to adhere to the regulation, to the travel policies, but also to the technical support that are implemented, such as travel tracking organizations that would allow their organizations to know where they are, what happens to them, how to communicate to them in a two-way fashion, so that if they are stranded for whatever reason related to COVID or maybe for all other threats we may see later on, there is the ability to manage this situation in a swift manner that would ensure that it can be minimized, or the risk or the consequences can be minimized as much as possible. So really this notion of a shared responsibility is probably something that probably come out of this crisis in the next few months, I guess.
Wonderful, thank you very much. The last questions I have for you both is, with that long-term lens, how do you think mobility will change shape in the future? And besides that, how long do you think that change will last for? Will it be something permanent, or will it be something that will be more short-term? So Michelle, can I pass this over to you?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and one that I don't think anyone can be completely confident in the answer to right now. But it certainly seems that the increased complexity that we're starting to face into is here to stay. The uncertainty will reduce over time, though, as governments and company policies are defined and start to settle in. We are seeing companies considering a wide range of different types of cross-border work arrangements. So looking at things like work from anywhere, HR policies, where people are allowed or even encouraged to work from a different location outside of their office. We're seeing things like the consideration for remote delivery centres, so moving away from a delivery centre where a lot of people are in one place and instead setting those up in a more remote fashion. But also things like virtual assignments, where instead of actually relocating for your assignments, you potentially carry out the work duties for that host entity, but from your home location. And a lot of organisations are seeing these virtual assignments as quite a powerful tool for diversity and inclusion, with international experience being available to key talent regardless of their personal circumstances. There's obviously pros and cons to that in terms of actually receiving that sort of cultural impact. I think COVID-19 has had quite a fundamental impact on the way that we work, and many organisations have been surprised at how effectively their employees have been able to work away from their office location. But what will be interesting to see is, as you highlight, Kayla, is how long that will last. So it's likely to be different, I think, across different industries and regions. While some industries like technology companies are promoting long-term work from anywhere policies, others are more regulated industries like banking and legal services, and also manufacturing, where there is expected to be the need for certain employees to get back to their office locations quite quickly. In the relatively short term, with office space being quite reduced, it's quite likely that different approaches will be taken in those organisations to different employees in different positions and roles, and this could be quite complex from a policy perspective to be managed. I think the other thing which really needs to be considered is the impact of long-term remote work arrangements on organisational culture and employee engagement. And what might seem really effective for 3 months might prove to be less so over a 12-month period or a 2-year period. But overall, I do think that we expect to see work arrangements and mobility continue to be different from what they were in January 2020. Employees are enjoying having more flexibility in their arrangements and more time at home with family. And I do think we'll en masse put pressure on employers to be able to allow much of that flexibility to continue. So the challenge for HR and mobility teams is really how to adapt to those changing expectations whilst managing all those risks that come from a more informal cross-border working pattern.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle. Very insightful and some good thought process in terms of what we may be looking forward to. The last question I had, maybe Dr. Philippe, is again with that long-term lens and change in global mobility, do you think the expectations from the assignee perspective will change, and in what way?
I am convinced this crisis is a sort of reminder of how important is the trust in the relationship between an employer and an employee when it comes to being deployed overseas as an international assignee. What happens with this COVID crisis may happen tomorrow in another fashion, another way, with another crisis. And the next one could be climate-related changes induced with an impact on travel, with even an impact on living in urban places, or from a health and security perspective, with all the consequences that can be anticipated. So I guess that's probably an opportunity for this thinking process to understand that what next after COVID? It could be another COVID-like issue. We're all expecting a pandemic flu. It's a COVID one today, but could be something different from an infectious disease perspective. Could it be an environmental disaster as well that would impact travelers and international assignees? I think that's what is expected today by travelers, is to recognize that they may be exposed to phenomena that are unpredictable or hard to predict, and that in a way their employers should put in place, as much as possible, as we discussed before, the measures, the standards, the policies, the training, the tools that would allow to decrease as much as possible the consequences of these events, whatever happens, I guess.
Great. Thank you very much, Dr. Philippe. Well, all I can say now is thank you very much to Michelle and Dr. Philippe for their wonderful insights today. As always, as the situation continues to evolve, please do get in touch regarding the latest information, advice, and assistance regarding COVID-19.